For today's episode, I have a compilation of scary stories from the deep woods. And before I begin, I would like to thank you for being a part of Mr. Scare's horror community. We are nearing our milestone of 2,000 subscribers. So I'll begin reading the stories, and meanwhile, make sure that you have subscribed to Mr. Scare. A few years back, I was hiking a mountain in the northern part of southern Oregon with my sister. It's a 72-mile trail, broken into two sections that can be easily hiked in a day. At the time, I lived about midway up the trail, fairly remote in a small community. It was the middle of fall on this day when we set out. The trail was running along the south side of the Umpqua River and was pretty up and down in the beginning. We made it to a fairly flat section that was running just above the river. There was this beautiful view of the river through the trees, so we stopped to get some pictures and take a water break. I immediately felt extremely uncomfortable, like someone was watching us. I slowly turned my head to look behind us, across the trail and up a very small incline. Through the trees, I could see a small meadow. Across the meadow, maybe 20 yards from us, was a tent. An old, typical canvas-style tent. As I'm looking, I noticed bones strung from the trees all around the meadow. They were suspended like creepy death wind chimes. My stomach just clenched and dropped. I leaned into my sister and whispered, "Do not. I repeat, do not turn around and look behind us. Just continue walking up the trail and run when I tell you." We were close enough to the river and no one could have heard me say this. She did exactly as I told her to, setting off at the brisk walk we'd been at before. We got maybe 10 yards, and I could hear footsteps through the forest floor, coming from behind and slightly above us. Now for context, that specific part of the forest is very dense. There's a thick moss cover under the trees, and that's why the footsteps taking over it make a very specific sound. I leaned forward and told her to pick up her speed. She did, I did, and so did whoever was behind us. I leaned forward again and told her to run as fast as she could and not stop until I told her to. For two middle-aged women, both slightly overweight, we ran like the wind. We ran and ran. I just kept telling her, "Go! Go! Go!" I could see ahead of us that the trail made an incline and veered to the right along the river and around a cliff. I knew at that point that whoever it was going to have to come down onto the trail or stop. So we kept running. We probably ran at least a mile after that, even though we could no longer hear anyone behind or above us. That section of the trail was about 7 miles, and we were not halfway when this happened. We eventually slowed down, but just hurried as fast as we could on the rest of the way. We had arranged for a friend to pick us up. We made it to the next trailhead fairly early, so we made our way out to 138 and started walking east toward home, knowing that he'd find us on the way. He did and was shocked at our story. We got home and immediately called our local sheriff, who lived just above us at the ranger station. He came to the house and heard our story. He explained it might be a day or two before they could get in on the trail, as they had a missing hunter at the time that they were searching for. So a few days go by, and he shows up at our house to let me know that we were not crazy or imagining things, and that someone really did chase us. I asked what they found and who it was. He looked down at the ground and then looked up and said,
"I'm not going to tell you what we found, or who it was, because if I do, you will never hike anywhere again. What we found was not normal and will not happen up here again."
He then instructed me to never, ever hike unarmed again. I thought that I would never find out what they found or who it was. But a friend of mine overheard the sheriff, and if I were to believe him, he told me that it was something inhuman and unbelievable. I'm guessing it was some sort of a cryptid that lived over there. Because even though I did not catch a glimpse of the entity, I could sense a feeling of being overwhelmed while I was around it. And maybe that's why he needed a team to take it down. And I hope there aren't any more of it. I never hiked that section of trail again, and it got completely burnt last year. I also never hiked unarmed, ever again. That was huge for me as I was not a gun person. I had many incidents living up there in a national forest with wild animals and other strange things, but nothing ever scared me as much as that day. I have spent countless days in the woods, and it's that one time, which was only a few seconds, that I cannot explain to myself. I go hiking at a distance whenever I can. Sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes, walking in the pitch dark with a low-light headlamp gets spooky. So I grew up in the woods of this area, and I've slept under a canopy of stars more nights than I can even count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trail, river banks, lake shore, ridges, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've lived and experienced the true experience of trekking. I'm establishing this because it's important for you to understand that I've heard, seen, and smelt about every single thing that this region has to offer in the way of the wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened at about 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for another hour past that until sunrise. I was on mile 5. I'm in a low bottom that's wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I'm on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush, young maple, and old oak growth. I'm focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, zoned out. Then I heard a loud cracking sound, and I froze solid in my spot. This is the part one have trouble describing. 4:30 a.m. in springtime means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. I froze mid-step. When fight or flight kicks in, you have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there balancing myself in silence was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and I'm going back the way I came in a hurry. You may wonder why. Well, that's because that sound was not of a branch breaking. It wasn't a deadfall. I was damn sure I had just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice, well, that meant get out of here. To describe it as best I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree. More a fungo bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head was that this sound was a crack and not a thud or thump. And I have described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and so terribly loud. I had the sense that it was about 50 yards directly in front of me, and it was loud and clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge going away from the creek. This meant, as soon as I got the courage to move toward this noise, I was going to have to turn my back on it and get up that ridge. This made me very nervous. My mind is assuming somewhere between meth, fiend, murder, and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes pass. I just breathe my foggy breath into my glasses and listen. Nothing. Dead quiet. I've got about 20 to 30 minutes until the first light. I crank up the headlamp and start to slowly creep to the 180-degree turn. When you are a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail. It just made things worse for me, especially in that situation. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. And then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagine wet, rotten, and death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter. This was like a days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast. By the time I made the top of that ridge, I was huffing and the first light was showing. I didn't stop moving until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, and especially leafed-out branches, make a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times, but I don't know what that was. And somewhere deep inside, I don't even want to know. My house is around the Lake of the Woods in northwestern Ontario. I remember one time, a friend and I were mountain biking on a hot August day when we ended up on a trail in the bush where there was an old abandoned car graveyard. Now, just for context, this was nothing too scary for us since it's pretty normal for people to scrap their cars in the bush around here. So we continue with our biking. My friend and I are excited to explore the area because there are a lot of interesting vehicles and their parts too. We ended up sticking around for about an hour or two until dusk was starting to set in when we came across a black 1950 Buick Roadmaster that looked like it got halfway through restoration. Now that's when we realized that something was sort of off about this place. There were no properties near this spot for miles, and it was very strange that someone would abandon such a beautiful car, that too halfway through a repair. My alarm bells were ringing, but only a little, and so we carried on. We were pretty exhausted from all the riding we were doing that day. We decided to find a place to rest and walked a little more into the trail towards a small dirt pile when we immediately realized that something was definitely wrong. The place was littered with animal bones from different animals. There were deer skulls, rabbits, dogs, and what looked like feline bones. I'm starting to feel a little sick to my stomach, but my buddy seems unfazed by it. I can't tell if he's the braver of the two of us or the less intelligent one at this point, because I keep telling him with increasing urgency that we need to get on our bikes and get the hell out of here. He tells me I shouldn't worry and tries to rationalize it by saying that it was some hunter illegally dumping here, despite the canine bones. He walked to the other side of the dirt pile, turned around ghost white, and said,
"We need to get the heck out of here now."
I managed to peek around and caught a glimpse of what was on the other side. Holy shit, someone had built a shrine here. At this point, I'm screaming inside of my head to leave, and I scramble to grab my bike and my backpack. As we're about to pedal off, we hear someone shouting to the right of us in the thick trees.
"Hey!"
I've never bolted so damn fast out of somewhere in my entire life. I tried to get a glimpse behind me, and I saw that there was an old man in a plain shirt and black jeans overalls near the dirt pile with a shovel in his hand, shouting at us and gesturing to us to come back. When we got close enough to the main road, we decided to take a break to catch our breath. My friend and I are soaked with sweat, drinking our water, and completely unsure of what we just saw. We sat on the road for about 5 minutes, relieved that nothing came of it, and talked about as to what it might have been. My friend was still trying to rationalize it. Suddenly, we can hear the loud vroom of a bike. My heart skipped a beat. We peeled it down the main road to his house in what felt like 2 minutes, for what should have been at least a 10-minute ride. I could feel the lactic acid building up in my legs from pedaling so hard, gears maxed out even going uphill. All this was like 10 years ago. To this day, I still don't know what was happening down that trail, but I'm glad I never stayed to find out. My uncle used to tell me a story from when he was a teenager hunting with my grandpa. They used to live in southern Idaho. One October evening, they had camped down in a valley and planned to hike up into the hills early the next morning. This was the kind of a place where they both didn't expect to see another human for miles. Early morning came and they set out into the hills a few hours before it was sunrise. Neither used a flashlight because their eyes had adjusted to the moonlight. As they were climbing the hill, my dad turned around to take a look at the valley of brush below them and their campsite in the distance. This is when he noticed several red lights moving quickly across the valley, several feet off the ground, and heading towards their camp. At first, he thought it could be a plane, but there were dozens of them, and they were randomly moving like a flock of birds and made no sound. Mind you, this was back in the 1980s, so drones weren't a thing back then. Dad was about to shout an alarm when my grandpa barked at him to keep moving. Grandpa's not the kind of man you would or should disobey, so Dad kept moving. A few minutes later, Grandpa stops, and he makes the two of them crawl into a bush, which provided a good covered position to look into the valley. It turns out, Grandpa had seen the lights moving about way back when they were still at the camp and wanted to get some distance between them. They pulled out some binoculars to try and get a better look, but didn't come up with much. They moved faster than birds and seemed to be just glowing balls of red light with no discernible features. Over time, it seemed obvious that they had been hanging out in the sky right above their campsite and continued to circle it for quite a while. The two stayed there watching them, not saying a word. Eventually, the sun began to rise over the horizon. And as it began to touch the valley floor, Dad's ears were blasted by an extremely loud and high-pitched sound that seemed to have come from the flying objects. When the noise eventually stopped, the objects began to rise higher into the air and headed up into the mountains in the opposite direction from their hiding spot. After a while, they returned to camp and found it absolutely trashed. Nothing was stolen, and it didn't seem like their food was eaten either, so they don't think it was bandits or animals who did it. All they know is those lights scared the hell out of them, and neither of the two went back there again. I was somewhere in the middle of the White Mountains during summer when I walked into what looked like a scene from a horror movie. A person with little or no hiking or camping experience had gotten himself in trouble. Big trouble. It was around 6 in the morning when I found the campsite. The very first thing that hit me was the eerie stillness around, until I noticed the shredded tent under a tree, and the desperate-looking human figure covered in blood, whimpering quietly. I put my bag down, grabbed my kit, and went over to the person. They looked like they had just lost a knife fight with a group of armed men. Deep slashes from one shoulder to hip, single punctures up and down his back, and hands and forearms full of what looked to be defensive cuts. I patched him up the best I could, gave him water, checked my map, and hightailed it to the closest road. The cell phone networks barely worked in the mountains. Thankfully, the road was very close by, around less than 2 miles, and I was able to flag someone down. They took off and I waited for assistance to arrive. It took about an hour until rescue arrived, and I led them to the still unidentified individual. He was not very conversant when I helped him out. I was sure he would be dead before we arrived, but I was wrong. I assisted the rescue by bringing him out and took them up on their offer to head into town and get cleaned up. After cleaning up and getting myself situated at their station, I went on my way, leaving them my number to call to let me know what was up with the person we helped out. I got home 3 days later, and there was a message on my machine. The story was that the guy I found decided to go camping one day and heard that he had to keep food hung from a tree to keep bears away. Well, he did that, but put it almost directly over his tent and not high enough. The night before I happened upon the site, a bear had used the tent and its occupant in an attempt to climb the tree to get to the food. The guy had woken up to 4 black bear paws sinking into his body, shifting to reach up. The dude survived and swore to the hospital staff that he was moving to the city and never going into the woods again. I was trekking through the Appalachian Trail with a couple of buddies when we happened to stumble across a bundle of sticks. The sticks were made into a figure, kinda similar to the ones from the Blair Witch Project. It was obviously placed there by someone, as it was dead center on the middle of the trail, leaning against a rock. I thought it was cool, so I grabbed it and put it in my backpack. Anyway, we finished the hike and set up for the night in our camping spot. We were all pretty wiped out from the long day, so after dinner we retired to our respective tents and called it a night. The next morning, I was the first one awake, so I got up to make some breakfast, and what did I find? An identical bundle of sticks to the one we'd found, sitting atop the pile of charred wood from the previous night's fire. The first thing I did was check my backpack, and sure enough, the one that I'd picked up a day ago was still there. Each of my friends swore they didn't put it there, and I obviously said the same. It was weird because we were all adamant about not putting it there, but I can never be sure one of them wasn't messing around with the other 2 of us. The thing that messes with me is the bundle I found in the morning was almost an exact replica of the one we found on the trail earlier. And I find it hard to believe one of the other guys could have made such a close replica without being able to model it after the one in my pack. And it's not like either would have placed the one on the trail beforehand for us to stumble upon, as it was too far out in the middle of nowhere. We did feel like we were being watched by someone or something. We did trek deeper inside and have a lot of fun, but the unsettling feeling lingered. We tried to search for any unusual tracks apart from ours, but there were none. We did feel nauseated at times, and you may say that bit was a little unusual. Apart from that, we felt a lot lighter as we moved far from the forest. Like some weight was lifted off our shoulders. I still want to believe one of them pulled a prank on the other two, because the alternative possibility scares the shit out of me.